My name is Audrey Miller. I am 32 years old. And I learned exactly what my parents thought I was worth from a hospital bed in room 304 of St. Point, Jude Medical Center, in a suburb of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on a rainy Tuesday night, with 3 broken ribs, a mild lung effusion, my entire right arm in a cast from wrist to shoulder, and my 6-week-old daughter, Hazel, in the hospital nursery 2 floors down, while my mother told me over the phone, over the sound of a casino floor in Atlantic City, to call myself an Uber. For 8 years, my parents had treated my stability and my kindness like a blank check they could draw from whenever they wanted. And on the one night I lay between life and death, they were willing to throw me away, like something that had finally outlived its usefulness. That sentence is the whole story. And I am going to tell you all of it, the 8 years. The rainy night, the phone call, and the 3 minutes on my phone with my one good hand that ended the Miller family bank forever. Welcome to Quiet Reckoning, the channel where the family bank finally closes its own account. If someone in your life has ever treated your generosity as their entitlement and then vanished the moment you needed anything back, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And tell me the moment you first realized you were the family's wallet instead of the family's child. And subscribe. Because the 3 minutes I spent on my phone from that hospital bed and the worn leather folder my grandfather carried into room 304 4 hours later is the part you came here for. Let me take you back to the rainy night. Because the phone call was not the beginning of how my parents treated me. It was just the night they finally did it while I was bleeding. You should know who I was. And who my family was. Before that Tuesday, I am a data analyst, an independent one. Which means I built my own client list and my own income out of nothing but skill and discipline. And I was good at it. Good enough that by the time I was 24, I was earning more than my father ever had in his life. I had married a good man named Ethan, who traveled for his work, and we had built a careful, stable life in a suburb of Philadelphia. And 6 weeks before that rainy Tuesday, we had had our first child, a daughter named Hazel, who was the entire center of my universe. I had grown up the older of 2 children in a family that had, very early, sorted us. My younger brother, Austin, was the favorite, the one my parents poured everything into, the one whose comfort was the organizing principle of the whole household. And I was the responsible one, the capable one, the one who, from the time I started earning real money, became the source the rest of the family drew from. It started small, the way these things always do. A little help with the mortgage when my father had a bad month. A loan for Austin's textbooks that was never repaid and never mentioned again. And then, 8 years before that hospital bed, my parents had suggested something that I now understand was the most expensive decision of my life, a family account. The Miller Family Trust. They called it, which made it sound dignified, official, shared. The idea, as my mother presented it, was that I would contribute to a central family account to help everyone through the rough patches. And because I was the one with the steady income and the head for numbers, it made sense for me to be the primary account holder, the one who managed it. I agreed. I was 24, and I loved my family, and I believed that helping them was simply what a good daughter did. Over the 8 years that followed, I quietly transferred a total of $520,000 into that account, more than $500,000, out of my own income, earned at my own desk, laid into my own nights. I want you to sit with that number, because my parents never did. $520,000. And here is what it was spent on, which I did not let myself fully add up until much later. Sitting in a hospital bed, my parents used it to pay off their entire mortgage. So they owned their house free and clear. They used it to buy 2 new cars. And they used an enormous portion of it to fund my brother Austin his tuition, his apartments, his lifestyle, his vacations. I was, in the economy of my own family, an invisible source of money. And the strange and painful truth is that I did not experience it as exploitation at the time. Because when you are raised to be the responsible one, the giving simply feels like love with a job attached. Every time I transferred money, someone in my family was briefly warm to me. And I mistook that warmth for the thing I had been starving for my whole life, which was to be valued. The only person who ever saw it clearly was my grandfather, my mother's father, Arthur, 78 years old, a retired Army accountant, and I want you to remember that he was an accountant, because it matters more than you can imagine, had told me, more than once, in his quiet, careful way. Audrey, the people who keep calling you their strong, responsible girl are usually just telling you who they've already decided they'll never have to carry. You watch. The day you need carrying, you find out what those words were really worth. I did not understand him. I would understand him completely on a rainy Tuesday night. In room 304. In about the length of one phone call. The crash happened on my way home from a late work session. It was raining hard, the kind of Philadelphia autumn rain that turns the roads to black glass, and I was driving home in my SUV, thinking about Hazel. When a tractor trailer ran a red light at an intersection on the edge of the suburbs and hit the side of my vehicle, I do not remember the impact. I remember waking up in the emergency department of St. Blaise, Jude Medical Center, in a level of pain I did not have words for, and a doctor telling me, gently, that I had 3 fractured ribs, a mild pleural effusion fluid around my lung, and a badly broken right arm that was going to need a cast from my wrist to my shoulder. I was stable. I was going to recover. But I was going to be admitted overnight, at minimum, and I was in no condition to do anything for myself, let alone for a 6-week-old infant. And that was the problem that took the breath I had left. Hazel, my 6-week-old daughter, had been with a sitter that evening. And in the chaos after the crash, the hospital had brought her to the St. Belden, Jude nursery, where she was safe and cared for, but hospital policy would not allow them to keep a newborn overnight without a parent or an authorized family guardian present. My husband, Ethan, was in Chicago, closing the most important contract of his career. And when I reached him, his voice breaking, he told me he was already trying to get to the airport, but with the flight and the weather and the drive, it would be 7 hours, minimum, before he could reach the hospital. 7 hours. And Hazel needed an authorized adult now. There was one obvious solution. My parents, Richard and Helen Miller, lived 15 minutes from St. Live. Jude, 15 minutes. So Ethan, desperate, from a phone in Chicago, called them, and then he called me back. And his voice had changed. And he told me, as gently as he could, what had happened. And then I called them myself, because I could not believe it. Because surely there had been a misunderstanding. My mother answered, and in the background, unmistakable, was the sound of a casino floor, the electronic chime of slot machines, the murmur of a gaming room. Atlantic City. My parents were 2 hours away in Atlantic City, at the blackjack tables, on a Tuesday night. Mom, I said, and my voice was shaking. Mom, I've been in a car accident. I'm in the hospital. Hazel needs someone. They can't keep her overnight without family. And Ethan's 7 hours out. I need you and Dad to come get her. Or come be here. Please. You're 15 minutes away, and my mother, over the sound of the slot machines, said the words I will carry for the rest of my life. Tell Audrey to just call an Uber and figure it out. Honestly, Austin has never once pulled some emergency stunt to ruin our weekend like this. We'll deal with it when we get back. And she hung up. I lay in that bed and I listened to the dial tone. And I thought about where my parents were and how they had gotten there. They were in Atlantic City, gambling, on a Tuesday money they did not earn, in a life they did not pay for, while my brother Austin was, at that very moment, on a luxury vacation on a beach in Miami, also on money he did not earn. All of it. Every dollar of the house and the cars and the casino chips and the Miami beach had come, over 8 years, from a daughter who was now lying in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs and a 6-week-old she could not get to. Being told to call an Uber, I did not cry. I want you to understand that because everyone expects the woman in the hospital bed with the broken ribs and the newborn 2 floors down and the dial tone in her ear to fall apart. And I did. For a few minutes I let the tears of pure disappointment come. And then I let them dry. Because something replaced them. Something colder and clearer than grief. A kind of terrible, total lucidity. 8 years. $520,000. And on the one night I needed them to drive 15 minutes, my parents chose a blackjack table and told me to call a ride share. My grandfather Arthur had been right. The strong, responsible girl had finally needed carrying. And she had just found out exactly what those words were worth. They were worth nothing. I want to stop here for a moment. Because if you have ever been the responsible one, the one everybody leans on, the one whose strength is praised right up until the moment you actually need something back, then you already know the specific cold that moved through me in that hospital bed. It is not heartbreak. Heartbreak assumes there was a heart on the other end of the line. It is the colder thing the moment you understand that the love you have been earning for years, with your money and your reliability and your endless capacity to give, was never love at all. It was an arrangement. And the second you stop being useful, the arrangement ends, even if you are bleeding in a hospital bed. If you have felt that exact cold, drop a comment and tell me how old you were when you felt it. Because nobody should carry it alone. And subscribe. Because what I did next, with one good hand and a phone, in the 3 most clarifying minutes of my life, is the reason I am telling you this story. I did not call my mother back. I did not text her. Or bait her. Or argue. I had spent 8 years explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was. Instead, lying in that bed, with my right arm useless in its cast. I picked up my iPhone with my left hand, and I opened my banking app, the Miller Family Trust. The account I had created, the account I was the primary holder of legally, completely, with full and supreme authority. A detail my parents had never bothered to understand, because understanding it would have required them to think of me as a person with power instead of a source of funds. I want to tell you exactly what I did. Because it took 3 minutes and 5 taps. And because every single one of them was the most lucid decision I have ever made. First, I transferred the entire remaining available balance, $42,000 out of the family account and into a private, secured account belonging only to me and Ethan. Second, I removed Richard Miller and Helen Miller as authorized co-owners of the account. Third, I canceled every linked supplementary credit card, the cards my parents and brother used as though the money behind them grew on a tree they had planted, when in truth, it had always grown on mine. And fourth, I changed every password, every security question, every piece of device authorization, so that there was no path back in. 3 minutes, 5 taps, with one hand, in a hospital bill, with 3 broken ribs, The financial lifeline that had fed 8 years of my family's laziness and greed was cut permanently and completely. From a room in the emergency wing of St. Radard, Jude Medical Center. And I did not feel cruel. I want to be honest about that. I did not feel vengeful or triumphant. I felt, for the first time in 8 years, like a person instead of an account. I set the phone down on the blanket beside my casted arm, and I lay back against the thin hospital pillow, and I breathed as deeply as 3 broken ribs would let me, and I waited for Ethan's flight, for my daughter, for the morning. What I did not know yet was that the phone call to Atlantic City and the 3 minutes on my banking app were only the first half of that night. What I did not know yet was that, 4 hours later, the door of room 304 was going to open, and it was not going to be my parents. Racing in from the casino to make it right. It was going to be a 78-year-old man, a retired Army accountant. My grandfather Arthur, walking in slowly with a worn brown leather folder held against his chest, and what was inside that folder was going to turn the worst night of my life into the night the Miller family finally, completely, ran out of road. It was 4 hours after the crash, a little past 2 in the morning, when the door of room 304 opened. I had been lying in the dark, awake, listening to the rain against the window and the soft mechanical sounds of the hospital at night, waiting for Ethan's flight to land in Philadelphia. When the door swung slowly inward and it was not my parents. I had stopped expecting my parents the moment my mother hung up over the sound of the slot machines. But some small, stubborn, 8-year-old part of me had kept listening for footsteps in the hall anyway. The way you keep pressing a bruise to see if it still hurts? The footsteps that finally came were slow and careful and belonged to an old man. My grandfather Arthur came into the room, 78 years old, in a buttoned coat, still damp from the rain, moving with the deliberate care of a man whose body has slowed but whose mind never has. And he was holding, pressed against his chest with both arms, the way you hold something that matters more than it looks, a worn brown leather folder, cracked and softened with age. He stopped at the foot of my bed and he looked at me at the cast, at the bruising, at the wires and the monitor, and his eyes filled. And his voice, when it came, was rough. "Audrey, girl. Oh, sweetheart. Look what they let happen to you." He had driven himself from New Jersey in the rain, in the middle of the night, at 78 years old. The moment Ethan had reached him because Ethan, unable to get my parents, unable to get anyone, had finally thought to call the one Miller who had never once let me down. My grandfather had gotten in his car and driven through a storm to be in that room, while my parents finished their night at the blackjack tables 2 hours away. He pulled the hard plastic chair up to the side of my bed, and he sat, and he set the leather folder on his knees. And for a moment he just held my good hand in both of his aslash, and neither of us said anything. And that silence was the first kind thing that had happened to me since the headlights came through the rain. And then my phone, on the blanket beside my casted arm, began to buzz, and buzz, and buzz again. I picked it up with my left hand. The texts were already stacking, and they were coming from my mother and my father. And they were not asking about my ribs, or my lung, or the granddaughter sleeping 2 floors below them, a granddaughter they had refused to drive 15 minutes to protect. They were about money. My parents had tried, at the cashier's cage in Atlantic City, to settle their hotel bill and buy another round of chips, and the cards had declined. All of them. Because 4 hours earlier, I had canceled every supplementary card on the family account from this very bed. And the declined cards had told them, faster than any phone call could have, that the bank had closed. My father's texts came in a rising flood. "Audrey, what did you do to the cards?" "Audrey, answer me. You think this is funny, embarrassing us in front of people. My phone buzzed again. You, ungrateful little after everything your mother and I have done for you. You want to throw your own parents out on the street. Is that it? You want us humiliated? Fix this right now. My mothers were worse. Because my mothers were wounded. How could you do this to your family? We are your parents. After all the sacrifices we made raising you, you've always been selfish. Audrey, this just proves it. Not one of them, and I read every message. In the dark. With my grandfather watching my face, not one of them asked if I was alive. Not one asked about Hazel. The daughter in the hospital bed and the granddaughter in the nursery had simply ceased to exist the moment the card stopped working. And all that remained, in the entire body of their messages, was rage that the money had stopped. My grandfather watched me read them. He did not ask what they said. He had known these people longer than I had been alive. And after a moment, he tapped the worn leather folder on his knees. And he said, in his quiet, careful, retired, accountant's voice, Audrey, before you answer them, and I don't think you should, but before you decide there's something I need to show you, I've been carrying it a long time. I think tonight is the night it's finally for. He opened the folder. I want to stop here for a moment, because what was inside that folder is the reason I am telling you this story. And if you have ever wished someone had been quietly watching out for you the whole time, you thought you were alone, then what I am about to describe is going to mean something to you. My grandfather Arthur had been a military accountant for over 30 years. Numbers were his language and his faith. And for 8 years, the entire 8 years, I had been pouring my income into the Miller Family Trust and watching my parents spend it. My grandfather, unknown to anyone, had been quietly keeping his own records. He had access to enough of the family's financial picture through his daughter and through documents that passed across family gatherings to do what a career accountant cannot help doing. He had been watching the money, and he had not liked what he saw. So, year after year, he had printed it out. Statements, transfers, charges, 8 years of the financial truth of the Miller family, assembled by a 78-year-old man who had decided, long before I did, that someday his granddaughter was going to need to see exactly where her $500,000 had gone. He laid the pages out on my hospital blanket, and every significant line had been highlighted by hand in red ink, and the red ink told the story my parents had spent 8 years making sure I never added up. There was $85,000 in my father's gambling losses, not a one-time thing. Not a bad weekend, but a steady, documented bleed of casino charges and cash advances across years. The Atlantic City habit that had ended my night in a hospital bed, funded by the daughter. He would not drive 15 minutes to help. There was $60,000 in my mother's luxury spending the designer purchases. The boutique. The things she wore to family gatherings while telling relatives how selfish her daughter was. And there was $120,000 that had gone to my brother Austin's lifestyle. His apartments. His clubs. The nightclubs in Miami. The very Miami he was lounging in that night, while I lay in room 304. All of it. Every dollar of it, paid for with my income. My late nights. My discipline. My misplaced love. My grandfather had been right that the night was finally for it. Because the folder was not just a record of grief, it was a weapon. Now, my grandfather said quietly, tapping the summary page. The one that carried the bank's own confirming signatures and seals. The page that tied the whole 8-year story together into a single, undeniable document. They're going to keep coming at you, Audrey, people like your parents always do. They'll cry, and they'll threaten, and they'll tell every relative who'll listen that you abandoned them. So, you're going to need them to understand, all the way down, that the bank is closed and it is not reopening. And I think this page is how you make them understand. I looked at the summary page, and I understood what my grandfather, the accountant, had understood for years. $500,000 had moved from my income into my parents' lives over 8 years, and not 1 cent of it had ever been reported by them, as the gift income it legally was, to the Internal Revenue Service. 8 years of unreported gifts of that size was not a family matter. It was tax fraud, and my grandfather's folder documented every dollar of it. With the bank's own seals, I did not type a long message. I had learned, somewhere between the slot machines and the leather folder, that the longest, angriest reply is still a reply, and a reply is still a door. So instead, with my left hand, I photographed the summary page, the one with the red highlights and the bank's confirming signatures, and I posted it, the image alone, into the family group chat where my father and mother and assorted relatives could all see it. And underneath it, I typed exactly 2 sentences. Your daughter's money has run out, along with her patience. Breathe 1 word, demanding another cent. And these documents go on the desk of the IRS for 8 years of unreported gift income and tax fraud. And then I set the phone face down on the blanket, and I did not pick it up again. The family group chat, the one that had been a rolling flood of rage and guilt and demand for hours, went absolutely, completely silent. The powerful father and the cutting mother, who had filled my phone with threats and accusations from a casino floor, vanished instantly, without a single word in response, because my father, whatever else he was, could read a bank document, and my mother, whatever else she was, understood the word fraud. And both of them understood, in the space of 1 photograph, that the dynamic of the last 8 years had just inverted completely. They were no longer the parents holding leverage over a dutiful daughter. They were 2 people whose entire financial history of theft and waste was now sitting, fully documented and bank sealed, in the one hand of a daughter they had just abandoned in a hospital. The silence in that group chat was the sound of every Miller realizing, at the same moment, that the bank had not only closed, it had hired the best accountant they had ever underestimated. And he had been keeping the books the whole time. My grandfather watched me set the phone down, and the corner of his mouth moved. The closest thing to a smile a man can manage at 2 a.m. in a hospital room. There it is, he said softly. You know, Audrey, your mother used to call me cold, said all I cared about was numbers. Maybe she was right, but the thing about numbers, sweetheart, is that they don't lie, and they don't forget, and they don't get tired of being ignored and decide to stop loving you. The numbers were always going to be here for you, evil even on the night nobody else was. That's why I kept them. I started to cry then, not the disappointed tears of the phone call, but a different kind. The kind that comes when someone shows you that you were being protected the whole time you thought you were alone. And my grandfather held my good hand, and he let me cry. And outside the rain kept falling on Philadelphia, and somewhere 2 floors below us, my daughter slept. And somewhere 2 hours away, my parents sat in a suddenly silent panic at a blackjack table. And somewhere in Miami, my brother had no idea yet that the money had stopped forever. And in room 304, for the first time in 8 years, I was not the family bank. I was just a woman with a broken arm and a sleeping daughter and a grandfather who had loved her enough to keep the receipts. I did not know yet what the next weeks would bring, the way my Aunt Clara would tear the whole thing open at Thanksgiving, the way my father would eventually start calling in secret from his car, the way my grandfather would make a decision that changed both our lives. What I knew, at 2 a.m. in room 304, with the group chat silent and the leather folder open on my blanket, was that the account my family had been drawing from my whole life had finally permanently closed, and that the quietest man in every room I had ever shared with him had been the one keeping watch over me the entire time. Ethan landed in Philadelphia at 4 in the morning and came straight from the airport to St. Teens. Jude. Still in his rumpled travel clothes. And the first thing he did was go down 2 floors to the nursery and bring our daughter up to room 304 so that I could see her face. Finally, after the longest night of my life, he held Hazel against his chest beside my bed, and my grandfather Arthur sat in the plastic chair with his leather folder closed on his knees. And the 3 generations of people who actually loved me filled that small hospital room while the family that shared my blood sat 2 hours away in a casino. Suddenly, completely silent, I was discharged 3 days later. My ribs would take weeks to heal. My arm months. And I went home to the careful, stable life Ethan and I had built, except that something fundamental had changed. And the change was this: for the first time in 8 years, no one was drawing from me. The Miller Family Trust was closed. The cards were dead. The bank was shut. And in the silence where 8 years of demands had been, I discovered something I had not felt since before I was 24. I discovered what it felt like to have my own income be my own. The fallout came, as my grandfather had promised it would prime. But not in the form my parents expected. They had spent the first days after the hospital trying a new strategy, not apology. Never apology. But a quiet campaign among the relatives. The version of events in which their ungrateful daughter had cut off her struggling parents and threatened them with the IRS out of cruelty and selfishness. My mother was good at that campaign. She had run it my whole life. But this time, there was a witness she had not accounted for. My great-aunt Clara, my mother's younger sister. A blunt, plain-spoken woman who had never had patience for my mother's performances and who carried real weight in the extended family, heard the campaign and did not believe it, and called me directly to ask what had actually happened. And I told her. And then, because I trusted her, I sent her a copy of one page from my grandfather's folder. Clara was quiet for a long time on the phone. And then she said, "Audrey, honey, I have spent 40 years watching my sister tell this family stories about everybody but herself. I think it's time this family heard one true thing. Will you let me?" I told her she could do whatever she felt was right. What Clara did was wait. She waited until Thanksgiving, the great gathering of the entire extended family. The one event where my mother performed her role of devoted matriarch most completely. The table set with the good dishes. The relatives assembled. My parents holding court. And at that table, in front of the whole family, Clara stood up, and she laid out the truth, the 8 years, the $520,000, the gambling and the luxury spending, and the Miami clubs. The night her niece lay in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs and a 6-week-old daughter while her parents played blackjack and told her to call an Uber. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not have to. She simply set the facts on the Thanksgiving table the way my grandfather had set them on my hospital blanket. And the facts did the rest. The portrait my parents had spent decades painting the devoted, struggling, hardworking Millers, burdened by an ungrateful daughter, came apart in front of the entire family in the space of a single Thanksgiving dinner. And the family, who had believed the portrait for years because they had never seen behind it, finally saw. My parents were not screamed at. They were not thrown out. Something quieter and more permanent happened to them. They were no longer invited. In the months that followed, the major family events, the weddings, the holidays, the milestone birthdays simply began to happen without Richard and Helen Miller. Because a family that had finally seen who they were did not want them at the table anymore. The selfishness they had hidden behind my generosity for 8 years was, once that generosity was withdrawn and the truth was told, all that was left of them, and the family wanted no part of it. My brother Austin, cut off from the money that had funded his entire adult life, came home from Miami to a reality he had never once had to face, and had to learn, at an age when most people have long since learned it, how to support himself. I am told he did not take it well. I would not know directly, because Austin has never contacted me. And I do not expect him to, because a person who has only ever known you as a source of funds has nothing to say to you once the funds are gone. My father was the only one who ever reached back toward me, and the way he did it tells you everything about what was left of him. Every so often, Richard Miller would call me not to apologize, because he never has, and I have stopped expecting it but to ask, haltingly, about Hazel, about his granddaughter. And he only ever called at one specific time, in the middle of the workday, during his lunch hour, from inside his car, in the parking lot of his office, because that was the only place and the only time he could call me without my mother and my brother Austin hearing him do it. My father, who had stood at the head of family tables and called me selfish, had been reduced to calling his own daughter in secret, from a parked car, on his lunch break, to hear about a grandchild he had been too busy gambling to drive 15 minutes to protect. I answer those calls. I want to be honest about that, because people expect the story to end with me cutting him off completely. And I have not. I answer, and I let him hear about Hazel. In careful, limited terms. Because Hazel having a grandfather who is trying, however poorly and however late, is worth something, but the boundary is absolute, and he knows it. He calls from the parking lot. He does not come to my house. He does not ask for money. Because he understands, now, that the bank is closed, and that my grandfather's folder still exists, the line between us has been drawn, and I drew it, and I will never let it be erased. But I have left a door open exactly as wide as a man calling from a parked car deserves, and not 1 inch wider. And then there is my grandfather. Arthur was so disappointed in his own daughter and son-in-law, so finished with them, that he made a decision that changed both our lives. He was 78 years old, living alone in the old house in New Jersey. The house full of decades of a marriage and a life. And after that night in room 304, he decided he did not want to spend whatever years he had left, 2 hours away from the one person in the family who had ever loved him back the way he loved her. So he sold the old house in New Jersey, and he moved to Philadelphia to a small large and warm apartment, exactly 5 minutes' walk from the home Ethan and I share with Hazel. He is 80 now. His body is slower than it was the night he drove through the storm, and the ordinary illnesses of his age have arrived. But his mind is exactly as sharp as it always was. And every Sunday afternoon, my grandfather Arthur walks the 5 minutes from his apartment to our house, and he has dinner with us, and he holds his great-granddaughter, and he asks me about my work and my numbers, the way only a retired accountant can, with real and specific interest, wanting the actual figures, delighting in them, and every Sunday, he brings the worn brown leather folder with him. He carries it the 5 minutes from his apartment, and he sets it down, carefully, on the bookshelf in our living room, right next to the small framed photograph of our little family, Ethan and Hazel and me. The first time he did it, I asked him why he kept bringing it. Now that it was over, now that the bank was closed and the family had scattered and there was no one left to threaten, and my grandfather looked at the folder on the shelf beside the photograph of my daughter, and he said, "I put it there, Audrey, in case anybody ever forgets how they once treated you. I want to leave you with the thing I understood on that hospital bed. The thing it took 8 years and a tractor trailer and one terrible phone call over the sound of slot machines to finally teach me. The people who are always praising you as the good child, the strong one, the responsible one, they are very often just putting a label on the person they have quietly. privately decided they will never have to reach out a hand to catch when she falls. Strong is the word people use for the person they have decided does not need them. Responsible is the word they use for the person they have appointed to carry everyone else. I had worn those words my whole life like they were love. And they were never love. They were a job description. And the job was to keep giving until there was nothing left. And to never, ever need anything back. The day I closed that account, from a hospital bed with one good hand, I stopped being a parent to grown adults who had refused their entire lives to grow up, and in exchange, I got back the one thing they had been quietly stealing from me for 8 years. Along with the money, I got back the right to be a mother. A whole, present, peaceful mother to my own daughter. Hazel will never know a version of me that is exhausted from carrying people who would not carry her mother. She will know a woman who learned and grace. Just in time. The difference between the people who love you and the people who use you and who chose. Finally, the ones who love. That is my story. A rainy night. A tractor trailer. A phone call over a casino floor. 3 minutes on a banking app. And a worn leather folder. A quiet old man carried through a storm to a hospital room because he had been keeping watch over me the entire time. I thought I was alone. If this reminded you of someone who only loves you when you are useful, take that as your sign. You are allowed to close the account. You are allowed to stop being the family bank. You are allowed to find out, the way I did, that the people who truly love you were keeping the receipts not to hold them against you, but to hand them to you on the night you finally needed to see the truth. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And tell me the name of the person who drove through the storm for you when the people who should have were busy at the table. I read every one. From a home in Philadelphia, with a sleeping daughter upstairs and a worn leather folder on the bookshelf beside our family photograph, and an old man who walks 5 minutes every Sunday just to ask me about my numbers. I am Audrey Miller. And the only thing I ever needed, in the end, was the 78-year-old grandfather who walked into room 304 inches the middle of the night, said a folder on mi hospital blanket, and showed me that the quietest man in every room had been the one paying the most attention and keeping the most careful, loving records the entire time.